The rain fell on Brooklyn like a confession no one wanted to hear. It drummed against the windows of the third-floor apartment on Sackett Street, where Marco De Luca sat alone in the darkness, staring at the phone that had just delivered the news. His mother was dead. Rosa De Luca, 73 years old, had passed away in her sleep in that cramped apartment in the Bronx, where she had lived for 40 years. The neighbor found her the next morning, still in her chair by the window, her sewing needle resting on her lap as if she had simply decided to close her eyes for a moment and never open them again. Marco did not cry. He had forgotten how. 15 years working for the Vassallo family had taught him many things, but none more thoroughly than the art of burying emotion so deep that even he could not find it anymore. He was the fixer, the man who made problems disappear, the ghost who cleaned the blood before the sun rose, who silenced the witnesses before they could speak, who buried the secrets so completely that not even God could find them. In the world of the Vassallo family, Marco De Luca was invisible, and invisible men do not cry. He heard the bedroom door open behind him. Veronica emerged in her silk robe, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her face carrying that expression of permanent disappointment that had become as familiar to Marco as his own reflection. She was beautiful, devastatingly so, with the kind of beauty that men started wars over and other women learned to hate. But her beauty had long ago become a weapon she wielded against him, a constant reminder of what she believed she deserved and what he had failed to provide. "What is it now?" she asked, not bothering to hide the irritation in her voice. It was 2 in the morning and she had a salon appointment at 9. Whatever crisis the Vassallo family had manufactured this time could wait until she had her 8 hours. "My mother died," Marco said. The words came out flat, empty, like stones dropped into a well with no bottom. Veronica paused. For a moment, something almost like human emotion flickered across her face, but it disappeared so quickly that Marco wondered if he had imagined it. She walked to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter with her arms crossed. "I am sorry," she said, though her tone suggested she was sorry only that this inconvenience had interrupted her sleep. "When is the funeral?" "I do not know yet. I have to make the arrangements." Veronica sighed, the sound carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken grievances. "Of course you do. Because that is what you do, Marco. You arrange things, you fix things, you clean up other people's messes." She paused, letting the words sink in like needles. "But you never seem to fix anything in your own life, do you?" Marco said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was the only shield against Veronica's cruelty. Anything he said would only give her more ammunition, more fuel for the fire of resentment that had been burning between them for years. So he sat in the darkness and let her words wash over him like the rain against the windows, cold and relentless, but ultimately unable to reach the hollow place where his heart used to be. She went back to bed without another word. Marco stayed in his chair until the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the clouds, and then he put on his coat and went to handle the arrangements. That was what he did, that was who he was, the man who handled things so that others did not have to. The funeral home in the Bronx was a modest establishment run by an old Italian family who had been burying the neighborhood's dead for 3 generations. Marco sat across from the funeral director, a thin man with compassionate eyes and the practiced patience of someone who spent his life in the company of grief and made the necessary decisions. A simple casket, a brief service, a plot in the cemetery where his father had been buried 20 years earlier. Rosa De Luca had never asked for much in life, and Marco saw no reason to pretend otherwise in death. He paid for everything in cash, peeling bills from the envelope he kept in his jacket for emergencies. The funeral director did not ask where the money came from. In this neighborhood, people had learned not to ask such questions. "Will there be many attending?" the director asked as he completed the paperwork. Marco considered the question. His mother had lived a quiet life. She had no siblings, no close friends that he knew of, no community beyond the small circle of women she had sewn dresses for over the years. Most of them were probably dead themselves by now, or too old and frail to make the journey. "Just me," Marco said. "It will just be me." The funeral director nodded, his face betraying nothing. He had seen every kind of grief in his years behind that desk, and he knew that the quietest funerals were often the saddest. A life reduced to a single mourner, a story that ended with no one left to tell it. The service was held 3 days later on a Tuesday afternoon, under a sky the color of wet cement. The priest spoke the familiar words, his voice carrying across the empty chapel like an echo in a cave. Marco sat in the front pew, alone, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the simple wooden casket that held what remained of Rosa De Luca. He thought about his mother as the priest spoke. He thought about the apartment where he had grown up, the smell of tomato sauce always simmering on the stove, the sound of her sewing machine humming late into the night as she worked to make ends meet. He thought about the way she had held him after his father died, her arms thin but strong, her voice whispering promises that everything would be all right, even when they both knew it would not be. He thought about the sacrifices she had made, the meals she had skipped so he could eat, the dreams she had buried so he could have a chance at something better. And he thought about how he had repaid her, by becoming a fixer for the mob, by marrying a woman who looked down on her, by visiting less and less as the years went by, always with the excuse that he was too busy. That work demanded his attention, that he would come next week, next month, next year. The excuses had piled up like unpaid debts, until finally there was no more time left to repay them. When the service ended, Marco followed the hearse to the cemetery. He watched as the casket was lowered into the ground beside his father's grave. He took a handful of dirt and let it fall through his fingers onto the polished wood. And then he stood there alone as the gravediggers began their work, filling the hole with earth until Rosa De Luca was gone forever. He did not know how long he stood there. The rain started again at some point, a soft drizzle that soaked through his coat and plastered his hair to his forehead. The gravediggers finished their work and left. The cemetery emptied. Still, Marco stood, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but stare at the fresh mound of earth that marked the end of his mother's story. It was nearly dark when he finally turned away and walked back to his car. The city was coming alive around him, lights flickering on in windows, traffic beginning to flow through the streets, the endless machinery of human life grinding forward as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Marco could feel it in his bones, a shifting of weight, a loosening of ties he had not even known were holding him in place. His mother was dead, the last person in the world who had loved him unconditionally, who had seen him not as a fixer or a ghost or a failure, but simply as her son, was gone. He was alone now in a way he had never been before. The apartment was dark when he returned. Veronica was not home, which was not unusual. She spent most of her evenings at charity functions and dinner parties and gallery openings, events where she could rub shoulders with the wealthy and powerful, while her husband cleaned up blood in warehouses and buried bodies in the pine barrens. Marco had stopped asking where she went long ago. The answers only made him feel worse. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat down at the kitchen table. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in on him, the silence heavy and suffocating. He thought about calling someone, but there was no one to call. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of this apartment, this job, this marriage that had become more prison than partnership. He had built his own cage, bar by bar, choice by choice, and now he sat inside it, wondering how he had ended up here. The front door opened at 10:30. Veronica walked in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, her coat draped over her arm, her face flushed with the glow of wine and conversation. She stopped when she saw Marco sitting in the darkness, the bottle of whiskey half empty beside him. "You look terrible," she said. She hung her coat in the closet and walked to the kitchen, keeping the counter between them like a barricade. "How was the funeral?" "Quiet," Marco said. Veronica nodded, as if this was exactly what she had expected. She poured herself a glass of wine and leaned against the counter, studying him with those cold, appraising eyes that always made him feel like merchandise being evaluated for return. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. Marco looked up. There was something in her voice, a tension beneath the casual tone that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He had heard that tone before, in the voices of men who were about to betray their partners, in the whispered confessions of those who knew they were already dead. "What is it?" he asked. Veronica took a long sip of her wine, as if fortifying herself for what came next. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. She walked across the kitchen and set it on the table in front of him, her movements precise and deliberate, like a dealer laying down the final card in a game that had already been decided. "I want a divorce," she said. Marco stared at the envelope. His mind, trained by years of crisis and catastrophe, immediately began calculating angles, looking for exits, searching for the hidden trap that surely lay beneath these words. But there was no trap. There was only the envelope, white and crisp and final, containing the end of his marriage. "I have already filed the papers," Veronica continued. "My lawyer says it should be straightforward. We have no children, no shared property worth fighting over." She paused, her lips curving into something that was almost a smile. "You will be free, Marco, free to live your sad little life without me dragging you down." Marco picked up the envelope. His hands were steady, though inside he felt something cracking, some last remnant of hope or illusion crumbling to dust. He had known this was coming, perhaps not today, not like this, but he had known. He had seen it in her eyes every time she looked at him, the disappointment hardening into contempt, the contempt crystallizing into something colder and more permanent. "Is there someone else?" he asked. The question came out automatically, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. Veronica laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, not exactly, but it carried a weight of satisfaction that cut deeper than cruelty ever could. She turned and walked toward the bedroom, pausing at the door to look back at him over her shoulder. "His name is Salvatore," she said. "Salvatore Vassallo. We have been seeing each other for 6 months. He proposed last week." She smiled, and in that smile Marco saw the death of everything he had thought his life was. "I'm going to be the wife of the Don, Marco. While you are still cleaning up his messes, I will be sitting at his right hand. Think about that when you are scrubbing blood off concrete at 3 in the morning." She disappeared into the bedroom. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded to Marco's ears like the closing of a coffin lid. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, the divorce papers in his hands, the whiskey untouched beside him. The rain had stopped, and through the window he could see the lights of Manhattan glittering across the river, a million lives being lived by people who did not know him, did not care about him, would not notice if he simply ceased to exist. Salvatore Vassallo, the Don himself, the man Marco had served for 15 years, whose secrets he had kept, whose enemies he had silenced, whose blood-soaked hands he had cleaned more times than he could count. That man had been sleeping with his wife, had proposed to his wife, would marry his wife while Marco continued to grovel at his feet, invisible and expendable and utterly alone. The humiliation burned through him like acid. He thought about all the times he had stood in that man's presence, head bowed, voice respectful, while Salvatore smiled and nodded and sent him off to do the dirty work that kept the empire running. He thought about all the secrets he carried, all the bodies he had buried, all the lives he had destroyed in service to a man who had been betraying him all along. And he thought about his mother, cold in the ground, the only person who had ever believed he could be something more than this. Marco De Luca was 43 years old. He had no money, no family, no friends, and no future. His wife was leaving him for his boss. His mother was dead. His life, such as it was, had been revealed as a lie built on lies, a house of cards that had finally collapsed under the weight of its own emptiness. He should have felt despair. He should have felt rage. But as he sat there in the darkness, staring at the divorce papers that marked the end of everything he had known, Marco De Luca felt something else entirely. He felt a strange, cold clarity settling over him, like frost forming on a window. He felt the chains of loyalty and fear and habit beginning to crack. He felt for the first time in 15 years the stirring of something he had thought was dead. He felt possibility. The old Marco would have accepted this. The old Marco would have signed the papers, packed his bags and slunk away into the shadows where men like him belonged. The old Marco would have continued to serve, continued to bow, continued to pretend that his life had meaning when everyone around him knew it did not. But something had shifted in the cemetery that afternoon, standing alone in the rain over his mother's grave. Something had broken free, And as Marco De Luca sat in the ruins of his marriage, he made a decision that would change everything. He would not accept this. He would not surrender. He would not disappear quietly into the night while Salvatore Vassallo and Veronica built their empire on the foundation of his humiliation. He did not know how yet. He did not know what weapons he could possibly bring to bear against a man like Salvatore Vassallo, a man with armies at his command and money beyond counting, and the loyalty of men who killed without hesitation or remorse. He had nothing. He was nothing. But he had something that Salvatore did not know about. He had 15 years of secrets, 15 years of buried bodies and silenced witnesses and hidden crimes. He knew where the skeletons were buried because he had buried most of them himself. And secrets, Marco knew better than anyone, were the most dangerous weapons of all. He folded the divorce papers and slipped them into his pocket. Then he stood, walked to the window and looked out at the city that had swallowed his life whole. The night was dark, but somewhere beyond the horizon, the first light of dawn was beginning to gather. Marco De Luca had spent 15 years living in the shadows. Now, finally, he was ready to step out of them. He just did not know yet that the shadows had plans of their own. 3 days after the funeral, as Marco was packing his belongings into cardboard boxes under Veronica's watchful and impatient eye, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find a man he had never seen before, a thin figure in an expensive suit with silver hair and the quiet, watchful eyes of someone who had spent his life among dangerous people. "Marco De Luca?" the man asked. His voice was soft, cultured, with the faint trace of an accent that Marco could not place. "Who is asking?" Marco replied. His hand drifted instinctively toward the small of his back, where he kept a knife strapped beneath his shirt. Old habits died hard, especially in his line of work. The man smiled, a small, careful expression that did not reach his eyes. "My name is Aurelio Benedetti. I am an attorney." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card, which he offered to Marco with a slight bow. "I represent the estate of your mother, Rosa Maria De Luca. May I come in?" Marco stared at the card. The name on it meant nothing to him, but the words the man had spoken echoed in his mind like the tolling of a distant bell. The estate of his mother. What estate? Rosa De Luca had owned nothing but a cramped apartment full of old furniture and older memories. She had lived on Social Security and the small payments she received for her sewing work. She had died, as far as Marco knew, with barely enough money to cover her funeral expenses. "My mother did not have an estate," Marco said. "There must be some mistake." Aurelio Benedetti shook his head slowly. "There is no mistake, Mr. De Luca. Your mother had many secrets." He paused, his eyes meeting Marco's with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "Perhaps it would be best if we discussed this in private." Marco glanced back at Veronica, who had emerged from the bedroom and was watching the exchange with poorly concealed curiosity. She raised an eyebrow, her expression asking the question she was too proud to voice aloud. "Give us a moment," Marco said to her. He stepped aside and gestured for the attorney to enter. They walked past Veronica to the small study at the back of the apartment, and Marco closed the door behind them. The study was cramped and cluttered, filled with boxes that Marco had been packing for his departure. He cleared a space on the desk and gestured for Benedetti to sit. The attorney lowered himself into the chair with the careful grace of a man who was accustomed to uncomfortable situations. "I will be direct with you, Mr. De Luca," Benedetti said. "Your mother came to me 30 years ago with a very specific set of instructions. She told me that upon her death I was to contact you and only you. She told me that I was to reveal to you the truth about her past and the nature of her holdings. And she told me that I was to do so only when I was certain that you were ready to receive this information." Marco sat down across from him. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. What holdings? What truth? "My mother was a seamstress. She made dresses for women in the neighborhood. That is all she ever did." Benedetti reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick manila envelope. He set it on the desk between them, his fingers resting on it for a moment, as if reluctant to let it go. "Your mother," he said slowly, "was born Rosa Maria Ferrante. She was the only surviving child of Enzo Ferrante and his wife Lucia. Enzo Ferrante was, until his death in 1964, one of the wealthiest men in Sicily. He owned shipping companies, textile factories, real estate across 3 continents. When he died, his entire fortune passed to his daughter. Marco shook his head. That is impossible. My mother grew up poor. She told me stories about going hungry, about working in the fields, about her father dying when she was young. Her father did die when she was young, Benedetti said, but not of natural causes. The Ferrante family was destroyed in a single night, Mr. De Luca. Your grandfather, your grandmother, your uncles and aunts and cousins, all of them killed by a rival family who wanted their empire. Your mother survived only because she was visiting a convent that night, preparing for her first communion. She was 9 years old. Marco felt the room spinning around him. This was insane. This was impossible. And yet something in Benedetti's voice, something in the calm certainty of his words, told him that every syllable was true. She escaped to America, Benedetti continued. She changed her name. She hid herself in the poorest neighborhoods she could find, living among people who would never think to look for the heir to a Sicilian fortune. She married a simple man, a good man, and she raised a son. And all the while she managed her inheritance from the shadows, investing quietly, growing her wealth through anonymous accounts and shell companies and intermediaries who never knew who they were really working for. Benedetti pushed the envelope across the desk toward Marco. His eyes were steady, unwavering, as if he had been waiting decades to deliver this message. Your mother, Rosa Maria De Luca, was worth approximately $1.3 trillion at the time of her death, and she left every penny of it to you. Marco De Luca sat in silence, staring at the envelope that contained the impossible truth of his mother's life. Outside, the city continued its endless churning, oblivious to the fact that everything had just changed. $1.3 trillion. And suddenly, the fixer who had spent his life in the shadows saw a path forward that he had never imagined possible. Marco did not sleep that night. He sat in the study long after Aurelio Benedetti had gone, the manila envelope open before him, its contents spread across the desk like pieces of a puzzle he had spent his entire life not knowing existed. There were documents in languages he could not read, account statements from banks in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands and Singapore, deeds to properties in cities he had never visited, stock certificates in companies whose names he did not recognize, and at the center of it all, a letter written in his mother's careful, elegant hand. My dearest Marco, the letter began, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the time has come for you to know the truth about who I am and who you are. I have kept this secret from you for your entire life, not because I did not trust you, but because I wanted to protect you from the weight of it. I wanted you to have a normal life, a simple life, free from the shadows that have haunted me since I was a child. But I see now that I was wrong. The shadows found you anyway, and I was not there to shield you from them. Marco read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning, new depths of sorrow and love and regret. His mother wrote of her childhood in Sicily, of the grand estate where she had lived as a princess among servants and gardens and rooms filled with sunlight. She wrote of the night everything ended, the screams and the gunshots and the smoke rising from the burning house as she hid in the convent chapel, praying to a God she was not sure she believed in anymore. She wrote of her escape to America, the years of hiding and fear, the slow realization that she could never go back to who she had been. And she wrote of him, of the day he was born, the happiest day of her life, of watching him grow, of seeing in him the strength and intelligence and quiet determination that had allowed their family to build an empire, of her pride when he graduated from high school, her worry when he began working for the Vassallo family, her heartbreak when she realized he had become trapped in a world she had spent her entire life trying to escape. I know what you have done for them, she wrote. I know the blood on your hands, the secrets you carry, the pieces of yourself you have surrendered in service to men who do not deserve your loyalty. I do not judge you for this, my son. How can I, when my own family's fortune was built on the same foundation of violence and silence? We are what the world has made us, but we do not have to remain so. The letter went on to explain the inheritance in detail. Rosa had spent decades managing the Ferrante fortune through a network of lawyers and accountants and financial advisors, none of whom knew the full picture. She had multiplied the family's wealth through careful investments, always staying in the shadows, never drawing attention to herself. The $1.3 trillion Marco was inheriting was the culmination of 60 years of patient, invisible work. But there was more. The letter spoke of the family that had destroyed the Ferrantes, the rivals who had orchestrated the massacre that killed everyone Rosa loved. They were called the Morettis, and they had built their own empire on the ruins of the Ferrante legacy. For decades, Rosa had watched them from afar, gathering information, tracking their movements, waiting for the day when she could reclaim what had been taken from her. That day never came, she wrote. I grew old, and my hatred grew cold, and I realized that revenge would not bring back what I had lost. So I chose a different path. I chose to give you the power to make your own choices, to live the life you want to live, to become the man you were always meant to be. Use this fortune however you see fit, my son. But know this, the Morettis are still out there, and they are closer than you think. Marco set down the letter and stared at the wall. His mind was reeling, struggling to process the enormity of what he had learned. $1 trillion, a murdered family, a legacy of blood and silence stretching back generations. And his mother, the quiet seamstress who had raised him in a cramped apartment in the Bronx, had been at the center of it all. He thought about Veronica, sleeping peacefully in the next room, dreaming of her new life as the wife of the Don. He thought about Salvatore Vassallo, sitting in his mansion in Staten Island, counting his millions while his men did the dirty work that kept the empire running. He thought about all the years he had spent groveling at the feet of men who saw him as nothing more than a useful tool, disposable and forgettable. And he thought about what he could do now. With $1 trillion at his command, Marco De Luca was no longer a fixer. He was no longer invisible. He was, whether he liked it or not, one of the most powerful men in the world. The question was what to do with that power. The answer came to him slowly, like dawn breaking over a dark horizon. He would not simply walk away from the life he had known. He would not disappear into some tropical paradise and spend his days drinking cocktails on a beach, while Salvatore and Veronica built their empire on the foundation of his humiliation. No. He would stay. He would watch. And he would dismantle everything they had built, piece by piece, secret by secret, until there was nothing left but ashes and regret. But he would have to be careful. Salvatore Vassallo had not become the Don by being careless. He had eyes everywhere, informants in every corner of the city, soldiers who would kill without hesitation at his command. If Marco moved too quickly, if he revealed his hand too soon, he would be dead before he could spend a single dollar of his inheritance. So he would play the part. He would sign the divorce papers, accept the humiliation, let everyone believe that Marco De Luca was exactly what they had always thought he was, a broken man, a failure, a nobody who had finally been discarded by the machine he had served for so long. He would disappear into the shadows, just as his mother had done, and from those shadows he would begin to pull the strings that would bring the Vassallo empire crashing down. The next morning, Marco signed the divorce papers at the kitchen table, while Veronica watched with barely concealed triumph. She was already wearing a new ring, a diamond the size of a small grape that sparkled obscenely in the morning light. Salvatore's ring, the ring that marked her as the property of the Don. "I hope you find what you are looking for," Marco said as he handed her the signed documents. His voice was calm, neutral, betraying nothing of the storm that raged beneath the surface. Veronica laughed, that same satisfied laugh she had given him on the night she revealed her betrayal. "What I was looking for was right in front of me all along, Marco. I just had to have the courage to reach out and take it." She tucked the papers into her purse and walked toward the door. "Your things are in boxes in the hallway. I expect you to be gone by noon. Salvatore is sending movers this afternoon." She left without looking back. Marco stood in the empty apartment, surrounded by the cardboard boxes that contained everything he owned, and allowed himself a small, cold smile. Let her believe she had won. Let them all believe it. The truth would reveal itself soon enough. He spent the next week establishing the infrastructure of his revenge. Aurelio Benedetti proved invaluable in this regard, connecting Marco with a network of lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors who could help him navigate the labyrinthine world of his inheritance. Marco set up new accounts, established shell companies, created layers of anonymity that would make it impossible to trace his activities back to their source. He rented a modest apartment in Queens, far from the eyes of the Vassallo family, and began the slow, patient work of learning everything there was to know about his enemies. The files Benedetti had given him contained decades of information about the Vassallo family's operations: drug trafficking, human smuggling, extortion, murder. The empire was vast and profitable, but it was also vulnerable. There were cracks in the foundation, weaknesses that could be exploited by someone with enough patience and resources. And Marco had both in abundance. But there was something else in those files, something that made Marco's blood run cold when he discovered it. The connection his mother had hinted at in her letter, the link between the Vassallos and the family that had destroyed the Ferrantes. The Morettis had not simply disappeared after the massacre in Sicily, they had evolved, merged with other families, spread their influence across the Atlantic. And one of their descendants, a man named Giacomo Moretti, had married into the Vassallo family 50 years ago. His daughter had become the wife of the previous Don. His grandson was Salvatore Vassallo himself. Marco sat in his empty apartment, staring at the family tree that Benedetti had drawn for him, and felt the pieces clicking into place. The family that had murdered his grandparents, his aunts and uncles, his entire bloodline, was the same family that had stolen his wife, humiliated him, and cast him aside like garbage. The circle was complete. The past and the present had merged into a single, undeniable truth. This was not just about revenge anymore. This was about justice. This was about settling a debt that had been owed for 60 years, and Marco De Luca, the invisible fixer, the forgotten man, would be the one to collect it. He began his campaign with information. In his years as a fixer, Marco had learned that knowledge was the most valuable currency in the underworld. Men would kill to protect their secrets, and they would pay even more to learn the secrets of their enemies. Marco knew more secrets than anyone, and now he had the resources to weaponize them. His first target was Tommy Graziano, a capo in the Vassallo family who had been skimming from the organization for years. Marco had helped cover up Tommy's theft on 3 separate occasions, disposing of evidence and silencing accountants who asked too many questions. Now he anonymously delivered that evidence to Salvatore Vassallo's desk. Tommy disappeared 2 days later. His body was never found. But everyone in the organization knew what had happened. The Don did not tolerate thieves, especially not those who stole from him while pretending to be loyal. Marco watched from the shadows as the Vassallo family tore itself apart, looking for the source of the leak. Accusations flew. Alliances fractured. Trust, already a rare commodity in their world, became practically non-existent. And through it all, no one suspected the quiet fixer who had been so publicly humiliated and discarded. His second target was more ambitious. Salvatore Vassallo had been laundering money through a chain of restaurants for decades, using the legitimate business to clean the profits from his illegal operations. Marco had helped set up the system, and he knew exactly where its weaknesses lay. A series of anonymous tips to the IRS triggered an investigation that froze the family's assets and forced Salvatore to scramble for alternative revenue streams. The investigation would eventually go nowhere. Marco had made sure of that, burying enough false leads to keep the federal agents chasing shadows for months. But the damage was done. The family's cash flow was disrupted, their operations thrown into chaos, their reputation among other criminal organizations tarnished by the appearance of vulnerability. And still, no one suspected Marco De Luca. It was during this period that Marco first encountered Enzo Carbone, the consigliere of the Vassallo family. Enzo was an old man, 70 years at least, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. He had served 3 generations of Vassallos, offering counsel and wisdom to men who often ignored both. Marco had always respected Enzo, even feared him slightly. The consigliere was not a man who missed details, and Marco knew that his own survival might depend on staying beneath that watchful gaze. They met by chance, or what appeared to be chance, at a coffee shop in Little Italy. Marco was sitting alone reading a newspaper when Enzo lowered himself into the chair across from him. The old man ordered an espresso and studied Marco with those piercing eyes for a long moment before speaking. "You look well," Enzo said. "Better than I expected, considering everything that has happened." Marco shrugged, keeping his expression neutral. "Life goes on. What choice do I have?" Enzo nodded slowly. "Indeed. What choice do any of us have?" He sipped his espresso, his eyes never leaving Marco's face. "I was sorry to hear about your mother. Rosa was a good woman. She deserved better than the end she received." Marco felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in the way Enzo said his mother's name, something that suggested knowledge beyond what should have been possible. But he kept his composure, years of practice making the mask effortless. "Thank you," he said. "She was. Did you know her?" Enzo smiled, a thin, enigmatic expression that revealed nothing. "I knew of her. There was a time many years ago when certain names carried weight in certain circles. Rosa Ferrante was one of those names." He paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. "But of course that was before she became Rosa De Luca, before she disappeared into the shadows and made everyone forget who she really was." Marco's blood turned to ice. He knows, he thought. Somehow, he knows everything. But he said nothing, waiting for the old man to show his hand. Enzo finished his espresso and set the cup down with a soft clink. "I am an old man, Marco. I have seen many things in my years of service to this family. I have watched men rise and fall, empires built and destroyed, secrets buried and unearthed. And I have learned that the truth always finds a way to the surface, no matter how deep we try to bury it." He stood, buttoning his jacket with the careful precision of a man who had long ago learned the value of attention to detail. "You should be careful," he said. "The game you are playing is more dangerous than you know. There are forces at work here that go back further than you can imagine, and not everyone who seems to be your enemy truly is, just as not everyone who seems to be your friend can be trusted." He placed a hand briefly on Marco's shoulder, a gesture that might have been paternal if not for the weight of warning it carried. "Your mother made her choices, and she lived with the consequences. Now you must make yours. I only hope you are wiser than she was." Enzo Carbone walked out of the coffee shop and disappeared into the crowded streets of Little Italy. Marco sat alone, his mind racing, trying to parse the meaning of the old man's words. Was it a warning, a threat, an offer of alliance? With Enzo it was impossible to tell. The consigliere had survived decades in a world where transparency meant death. He revealed only what he wanted to reveal, and his true intentions remained forever shrouded in shadow. But one thing was clear. Marco was not as invisible as he had believed. Someone was watching. Someone knew, or at least suspected, the truth about who he was and what he was planning, and that someone had chosen, for reasons Marco could not yet understand, to let him continue. It was a risk. Everything Marco was doing was a risk, but he had come too far to turn back now. The wheels of his revenge were already in motion, and nothing, not even the cryptic warnings of an old consigliere, would make him stop. That night, Marco received another piece of information that would change the trajectory of his campaign. Benedetti had been digging into the Vassallo family's history, searching for vulnerabilities that Marco might exploit. What he found was more than a vulnerability. It was a time bomb waiting to explode. Salvatore Vassallo had a daughter. Her name was Lucia, and she was 25 years old. She had been raised in convents and boarding schools, kept far from the family business, protected from the violence and corruption that defined her father's world. She was innocent, or as innocent as anyone connected to the Vassallos could be, and she was engaged to be married to the son of a rival family, a union that would cement an alliance worth billions of dollars. But that was not the revelation that made Marco's heart stop. The revelation was that Lucia Vassallo was not Salvatore's biological daughter. She was adopted, and her biological parents, according to documents that Benedetti had unearthed from sealed records, were members of a family that had been wiped out in Sicily 60 years ago. Lucia Vassallo was a Ferrante. She was Marco's cousin. Marco sat in his apartment, staring at the documents that proved the impossible truth. The Vassallos had unknowingly raised a Ferrante as their own daughter. The blood of Marco's massacred family ran through the veins of the woman who called Salvatore father, and she had no idea who she really was. This changed everything. Marco had been planning to destroy the Vassallo family, to burn their empire to the ground and salt the earth so nothing could ever grow there again. But now there was an innocent caught in the crossfire, a woman who shared his blood, who was as much a victim of the Vassallos as he was. He could not destroy her along with them. He would have to find another way. And so Marco De Luca, the fixer who had spent his life solving other people's problems, faced the most complicated problem of his career. How do you take revenge on a family without destroying the one innocent person trapped inside it? How do you burn down a house while saving the prisoner locked in the basement? He did not have the answers yet, but he would find them. He had $1 trillion, a lifetime of secrets, and a patience that had been forged in the fires of humiliation and betrayal. The game was just beginning, and Marco De Luca intended to win. 3 weeks after his encounter with Enzo Carbone, Marco received an invitation that surprised him. It was hand-delivered by a messenger in a black suit, a cream-colored envelope sealed with wax bearing the Vassallo family crest. Inside was a single card, elegant and understated, requesting his presence at the engagement party of Lucia Vassallo and Antonio Benedetto. The party was to be held at the Vassallo mansion in Staten Island, the very heart of the empire Marco was working to destroy. And the invitation had been sent not by Salvatore but by Veronica. The new Mrs. Vassallo, it seemed, wanted to ensure that her former husband witnessed her triumph in person. Marco smiled as he read the invitation. Veronica thought she was twisting the knife, rubbing salt in wounds that she believed would never heal. She had no idea that she was actually giving him exactly what he needed: access to the inner sanctum, a chance to observe his enemies up close, and an opportunity to meet the cousin he had never known existed. He would accept the invitation, of course. He would dress in his finest suit, paste a broken smile on his face, and play the part of the defeated ex-husband. He would let them all laugh at him, pity him, dismiss him as irrelevant. And while they were busy celebrating their victory, he would be watching, learning, planning the next move in a game they did not even know they were playing. The night of the engagement party arrived cold and clear, the stars glittering above Staten Island like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Marco arrived alone, driving a modest rental car that would not draw attention among the Ferraris and Bentleys, filling the circular driveway of the Vassallo mansion. He handed his keys to a valet, who barely glanced at him and walked up the marble steps to the front door. The mansion was magnificent, a testament to generations of ill-gotten wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across walls, adorned with Renaissance paintings and Venetian mirrors. A string quartet played softly in the corner of the grand ballroom, their music nearly drowned out by the chatter of 300 guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and canapes, their movements choreographed with military precision. And there, at the center of it all, stood Salvatore Vassallo and his new bride. The Don was a tall man in his early 60s, still handsome despite the years, with silver hair swept back from a face that radiated authority and danger. Veronica stood beside him, radiant in a red dress that probably cost more than Marco had earned in a year, her hand resting possessively on her new husband's arm. She was laughing at something one of the guests had said, her head thrown back, her eyes sparkling with the joy of someone who had finally gotten everything she wanted. Marco felt the old hatred surge through him, hot and bitter, but he pushed it down. Tonight was not about hatred. Tonight was about reconnaissance. He moved through the crowd like a ghost, invisible as always, listening to conversations and filing away information for later use. He learned that the Benedetto family was nervous about the alliance, worried that Salvatore's recent troubles with the IRS were a sign of weakness. He learned that several of the capos were grumbling about the Don's leadership, questioning whether his marriage to a woman half his age had clouded his judgment. He learned that Enzo Carbone had been spending more time than usual with Lucia, as if preparing her for something, and then he saw her, Lucia Vassallo, his cousin. She stood apart from the crowd, near the French doors that led to the garden, a glass of champagne untouched in her hand. She was beautiful, with dark hair and dark eyes, and features that carried an echo of the photographs Marco had seen of his grandmother. But there was something else in her face, something that went beyond mere beauty. There was a sadness there, a depth of feeling that seemed out of place among the shallow glitter of the party. She looked, Marco realized with a start, like someone who was trapped, like someone who was playing a part they had never asked for, in a story they did not understand. He made his way toward her, moving carefully, ensuring that no one noticed his approach. When he reached her side, he did not speak immediately. He simply stood there, looking out at the garden, giving her the space to acknowledge him or ignore him as she chose. "You are Marco," she said finally. Her voice was soft, musical, tinged with an accent that spoke of European finishing schools and summers in Tuscany. "My stepmother's former husband," Marco nodded. "And you are the guest of honor. Congratulations on your engagement." Lucia smiled, but there was no joy in it. "Thank you. It is a beautiful party, is it not? All these people celebrating a union that will bring peace and prosperity to our families." She turned to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "Tell me, Marco, do you believe in arranged marriages?" The question caught him off guard. He considered it for a moment before answering. "I believe that marriage should be a choice made freely by both parties, but I have learned that in our world, freedom is often an illusion." Lucia nodded slowly, as if he had confirmed something she already suspected. "My father chose Antonio for me. He is a good man, I think, or as good as anyone in our world can be. But I have never loved him. I do not know if I am capable of loving anyone. Is that strange?" Marco thought of his mother, who had spent 60 years hiding her true self from the world. He thought of his own marriage, built on lies and maintained through silence. He thought of all the people in this room, smiling and laughing while secrets festered beneath the surface. "No," he said. "It is not strange at all. It is survival." They stood in silence for a moment, two strangers connected by blood they did not yet know they shared. Marco wanted to tell her the truth, to reveal who she really was and what had been done to her family. But he held back. The time was not right. There were too many eyes watching, too many ears listening, and he was not yet sure how Lucia would react to such devastating news. Instead, he asked her a question. "If you could be anywhere in the world right now, where would you be?" Lucia considered this. "Somewhere quiet," she said. "Somewhere far from all of this. A small house by the sea, perhaps, where no one knows my name or my family's history. Where I could wake up in the morning and be nothing more than myself." She laughed softly, a sound tinged with melancholy. "But that is a fantasy, is it not? We cannot escape who we are. The blood in our veins follows us wherever we go." Marco felt something shift inside him. For the first time since he had learned of Lucia's existence, he understood what he had to do. His revenge could not be complete destruction. It had to be liberation. He would tear down the Vassallo empire, yes, but he would also free the innocent who were trapped within it. He would give Lucia the life she dreamed of, the life that had been stolen from her before she was even born. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "the blood in our veins can be a source of strength rather than a prison. Perhaps who we are is not determined by our families, but by the choices we make." Lucia looked at him with something like hope in her eyes. "Do you really believe that?" Before Marco could answer, a hand fell on his shoulder. He turned to find Salvatore Vassallo standing behind him, his expression unreadable, his presence radiating the cold authority of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed. "Marco," the Don said, "I'm glad you could join us. I was just telling Veronica how brave you were to accept the invitation. Most men in your position would have stayed home, nursing their wounds. But you have always been different, have you not? Always watching, always waiting, always playing the long game." Marco met the Don's gaze without flinching. "I am just here to pay my respects, Salvatore. Nothing more." The Don smiled, a thin, predatory expression that did not reach his eyes. "Of course you are." He turned to Lucia, his demeanor softening slightly. "My dear, your fiancé is looking for you. I believe it is time for your dance." Lucia nodded, her face becoming a mask of polite obedience. "Of course, Father." She glanced at Marco one last time, something unspoken passing between them. and then she walked away toward the ballroom. Salvatore watched her go, his expression thoughtful. She is a beautiful girl, is she not? The pride of my family. He turned back to Marco, his eyes hardening. I would hate for anything to happen to her, or to anyone who might threaten her happiness. The threat was clear, though its target was unclear. Did Salvatore suspect something? Or was this simply the reflexive intimidation of a man who saw enemies everywhere? Marco kept his expression neutral. She seems like a wonderful young woman. I am sure she will have a very happy life. The Don studied him for a long moment, as if trying to see past the mask to whatever lay beneath. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and walked away to rejoin his guests. Marco stood alone by the French doors, watching the party swirl around him, and allowed himself to feel the first spark of something he had not experienced in a very long time. Hope. The game was far from over. The most dangerous moves were still to come. But for the first time, Marco De Luca believed that he might actually win. Not just for himself, not just for his mother, but for Lucia, the cousin he had never known, the last surviving Ferrante besides himself. He would save her. He would destroy the empire that had held her captive, and he would ensure that the sins of the past were finally, irrevocably, paid in full. The fixer had a new mission now, and he would not rest until it was complete. The weeks following the engagement party became a delicate dance of shadows and patience. Marco continued his quiet campaign against the Vassallo Empire, each move calculated to cause maximum damage with minimum visibility. He purchased debts owed by key Vassallo associates, calling them in at the most inconvenient moments. He funded rival operations that encroached on Vassallo territory, creating conflicts that drained resources and attention. He whispered secrets into the ears of journalists and federal agents, always through intermediaries, always untraceable, always devastating. The family was bleeding, though most of its members did not yet understand the depth of the wound. Profits were down, alliances were fraying, and Salvatore Vassallo, the Don who had ruled unchallenged for 2 decades, was beginning to show cracks in his armor. But Marco's attention was increasingly drawn to another matter entirely. Lucia Vassallo haunted his thoughts in ways he had not anticipated. Their brief conversation at the engagement party had planted a seed that he could not ignore. She was family, the only family he had left, and she was trapped in a gilded cage built by the very people who had destroyed their bloodline. He began to watch her from afar, careful not to draw attention, learning the patterns of her life. She lived in a townhouse in Manhattan, a gift from her father, surrounded by security guards who monitored her every movement. She attended charity functions and gallery openings, always accompanied by her fiancé Antonio Benedetto, always wearing the same mask of polite detachment that Marco had seen at the party. She visited her father's mansion every Sunday for dinner, sitting at the long table while Veronica held court, and Salvatore discussed business with his lieutenants, and she was miserable. Marco could see it in the way she moved, the way she held herself, the way her eyes went distant whenever Antonio touched her arm. She was a prisoner in everything but name, bound by duty and expectation to a life she had never chosen. He needed to reach her. He needed to tell her the truth about who she was and offer her a way out. But direct contact was too dangerous. The Vassallo security apparatus would flag any approach, and Marco could not afford to reveal his hand before he was ready. So he found another way. Aurelio Benedetti had connections everywhere, including within the art world that Lucia frequented. Through a series of carefully orchestrated introductions, Marco established himself as an anonymous patron of a small gallery in Chelsea that Lucia visited regularly. He donated generously to causes she supported, ensuring that his name appeared on the same lists as hers, and he waited, patient as always, for the opportunity to present itself. It came on a rainy Thursday evening in late October. The gallery was hosting a private viewing of a new collection, paintings by an emerging Sicilian artist whose work depicted scenes of rural life from a vanished era. Lucia attended alone, her security detail waiting outside, her fiancé occupied with business elsewhere. Marco arrived shortly after her, dressed in a simple black suit, looking like nothing more than another wealthy art enthusiast. He found her standing before a painting of an old farmhouse, its white walls glowing against a backdrop of olive groves and distant mountains. She was crying. The tears slid silently down her cheeks, and she made no move to wipe them away, as if she had forgotten that anyone else existed. Marco approached slowly, giving her time to notice him, to compose herself if she wished. But she did not turn away. She simply stood there staring at the painting, as if it held answers to questions she had not known she was asking. "It reminds you of something," Marco said quietly. It was not a question. Lucia nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know why. I have never been to Sicily. I have never seen a place like this. But when I look at it, I feel as if I am remembering something I have lost, something I never knew I had." Marco stood beside her, looking at the painting. The farmhouse could have been anywhere in rural Sicily, but something about it tugged at his memory as well. He thought of the photographs his mother had shown him, images of the Ferrante estate before it was burned to the ground. The architecture was different, but the feeling was the same. A sense of home, a sense of belonging. "Perhaps some memories live in the blood," he said. "Perhaps we carry the experiences of our ancestors without knowing it." Lucia turned to look at him, recognition flickering in her eyes. "You are Marco, from the party." "I am," he acknowledged. "I hope I am not intruding." She shook her head, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "No, I am glad to see a familiar face. Everyone else here looks at me like I am an exhibit myself, the daughter of Salvatore Vassallo, on display for their entertainment. Is that how you feel, like you are on display?" Lucia laughed bitterly. "That is how I have felt my entire life. I was raised to be a symbol, a trophy, a bridge between families. My thoughts, my feelings, my desires, none of them matter. What matters is the role I play in my father's plans." Marco chose his next words carefully. "And if you could step out of that role, if you could be free of your father's plans and live the life you truly wanted." She looked at him with something like hunger in her eyes. "That is an impossible dream. You know how our world works, Marco. There is no escape. Not for people like us." "People like us," Marco repeated. He paused, weighing the risk of what he was about to say. "What if I told you that there might be a way? What if I told you that you have options you do not even know exist?" Lucia's eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping into her expression. "What do you mean? Why would you help me? You do not even know me." Marco met her gaze steadily. "I know more about you than you think, Lucia. And I know that your life does not have to be defined by the family that raised you." Before she could respond, the gallery door opened and two of her security guards entered, their eyes scanning the room with professional efficiency. One of them spotted Lucia and started toward her, his hand moving instinctively toward the bulge beneath his jacket. "Miss Vassallo," the guard said, his voice carefully neutral, "your father has requested that we bring you home. He is concerned about the weather." Lucia's face became a mask again, all emotion hidden beneath layers of practiced composure. "Of course I was just leaving." She turned back to Marco, her eyes conveying a message that her words could not. "Perhaps we will meet again, Mr. De Luca. I would be interested to hear more about these options you mentioned." She walked away with the guards flanking her, disappearing into the rainy night. Marco stayed in the gallery for another hour, pretending to admire the artwork, his mind racing with the implications of their conversation. He had made contact. He had planted the seed of doubt in her mind. Now he needed to nurture it carefully, bringing her closer to the truth without triggering the suspicions of her protectors. The game had entered a new phase, and the stakes were higher than ever. 2 days later, Marco received an unexpected visitor at his apartment in Queens. He opened the door to find Enzo Carbone standing in the hallway, his silver hair damp from the rain, his eyes carrying that same knowing look that had unsettled Marco at their first meeting. "May I come in?" the consigliere asked. His voice was calm, but there was an urgency beneath the surface that Marco had never heard before. Marco stepped aside without a word, allowing the old man to enter. He closed the door and watched as Enzo surveyed the modest apartment, his gaze lingering on the stacks of files and documents that covered every surface. "You have been busy," Enzo observed. He lowered himself into a chair with the careful movements of a man whose body was beginning to betray him. I must admit, I underestimated you, Marco. I thought you were broken. I thought the divorce and the humiliation had destroyed whatever fight you had left. But I was wrong. Marco remained standing, his back against the wall, his eyes never leaving the old man. "Why are you here, Enzo?" The consigliere smiled. That same enigmatic expression that revealed everything and nothing. "I am here because I have watched this family destroy itself for 50 years, and I am tired of it. I am here because I loved Rosa Ferrante like a daughter, and I made a promise to her that I intend to keep." Marco felt the floor shift beneath his feet. "You knew my mother. You knew who she really was." Enzo nodded slowly. "I was young when the Ferrante massacre happened. I was working for the Morettis then, a minor soldier with ambitions beyond my station. I saw what they did to that family, Marco. I saw the bodies. I saw the flames. And I saw the little girl who escaped, the one who should have died with all the others." He paused, his eyes distant, lost in memories that were 60 years old but still fresh enough to draw blood. "I could have told them about her. I could have revealed where she was hiding and earned my place among the inner circle. But I did not. Something stopped me. Call it conscience, call it cowardice, call it whatever you like. I kept her secret, and I have kept it ever since." Marco moved to the window, staring out at the rain-slicked streets. "Why are you telling me this now? Because the time has come to end it," Enzo said. "Because Salvatore is not the man his grandfather was. He is weak, paranoid, increasingly unstable. The marriage to your ex-wife has only made things worse. She fills his head with poison, turns him against his own people, pushes him toward decisions that will destroy everything. If something is not done soon, the family will tear itself apart, and many innocent people will be caught in the wreckage." "Including Lucia," Marco said. It was not a question. Enzo's expression softened. "Including Lucia. She is the only good thing to come out of this cursed family. She deserves better than what awaits her." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small envelope which he set on the table between them. "This contains information that you will find useful. Account numbers, passwords, locations of assets that Salvatore has hidden from everyone, including his own accountants. It also contains evidence of crimes that he has committed personally, crimes that even his lawyers cannot explain away. Use it wisely." Marco picked up the envelope, feeling its weight in his hand. "What do you want in return?" Enzo stood, buttoning his jacket with those same careful movements. "I want justice for Rosa Ferrante. I want freedom for her granddaughter, even if Lucia does not know that is what she is. And I want peace for myself at last after a lifetime of serving monsters." He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the knob. "One more thing. Veronica is more dangerous than you realize. She has ambitions that go far beyond being the wife of the Don. She wants to control the family herself, and she is willing to destroy anyone who stands in her way. Including you, including Lucia, including Salvatore himself when he is no longer useful to her." The old man opened the door and stepped into the hallway. "Be careful, Marco. The endgame is approaching, and not everyone will survive to see its conclusion." He was gone before Marco could respond, disappearing into the shadows like a ghost returning to the grave. Marco stood alone in his apartment, the envelope in his hand, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had learned. Enzo Carbone, the consigliere of the Vassallo family, had been protecting his mother's secret for 60 years. He had watched over Lucia from within the heart of the enemy, waiting for the moment when someone would come to claim the Ferrante legacy. That someone was Marco. And now, armed with information from the inside, he had everything he needed to bring the Vassallos down. But Enzo's warning about Veronica stayed with him. His ex-wife had always been ambitious, always hungry for more than what life had given her. Marco had assumed that her marriage to Salvatore was the culmination of those ambitions, the ultimate prize in a game she had been playing for years. But what if it was just another step? What if she was planning something even bigger? He needed to know more. He needed to understand the full scope of Veronica's plans before he made his next move. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. Through his network of informants, Marco learned that Veronica had been holding secret meetings with representatives from other families, meetings that Salvatore knew nothing about. She was building alliances behind her husband's back, positioning herself as the power behind the throne, ready to take control when the moment was right. Marco arranged to have one of these meetings monitored. The recording that came back confirmed his worst fears. Veronica was not just planning to influence Salvatore. She was planning to replace him. She had already secured promises of support from 3 of the 5 families, and she was negotiating with the remaining 2. The only thing standing in her way was Salvatore himself, and she had made it clear that she was prepared to remove that obstacle by any means necessary. The recording also revealed something else, something that made Marco's blood run cold. Veronica knew about Lucia's true parentage. She had discovered the adoption records years ago and had been holding on to the information, waiting for the right moment to use it. And that moment, according to her plans, was fast approaching. She intended to expose Lucia as a Ferrante at her wedding to Antonio Benedetto. The revelation would destroy the alliance between the families, humiliate Salvatore, and create the chaos Veronica needed to seize power. Lucia would be cast out, branded as the daughter of enemies, stripped of everything she had ever known. And in the aftermath, Veronica would emerge as the new power in the Vassallo Empire. Marco could not allow this to happen. His revenge against the Vassallos had always been about justice, about making them pay for what they had done to his family. But this was different. This was about protecting the innocent. This was about saving Lucia from a fate she did not deserve. He needed to move faster than he had planned. He needed to reach Lucia before Veronica could execute her scheme, and he needed to do it without alerting anyone to his intentions. The wedding was scheduled for 3 weeks from now. 3 weeks to dismantle an empire, expose a conspiracy, and rescue a woman who did not even know she needed rescuing. Marco looked at the files spread across his desk, the weapons he had been assembling for months. It was time to use them. It was time to end this. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had memorized but never called. Aurelio Benedetti answered on the second ring. "It is time," Marco said. "Begin transferring the assets we discussed, all of them, and contact the people on the list. Tell them the offer stands, but the window is closing." He hung up without waiting for a response. The next 3 weeks would determine everything. Either he would succeed in bringing down the Vassallo Empire and freeing Lucia from her gilded cage, or he would fail and lose everything, including his life. But Marco De Luca had not survived 15 years in the shadows by being afraid of failure. He had survived by being smarter, more patient, and more ruthless than anyone expected. And now, finally, he was ready to show the world what he was truly capable of. The fixer was about to become the destroyer, and when the dust settled, nothing would ever be the same. Marco spent the next several days executing a plan that had been taking shape in his mind since the night he read his mother's letter. Using the information Enzo had provided, he began systematically dismantling Salvatore's hidden financial empire. Accounts that had been secret for decades were suddenly frozen by international authorities. Properties that had been held through shell companies were seized by governments acting on anonymous tips. Business partners who had been loyal for years received evidence of Salvatore's plans to betray them and responded by terminating their arrangements. The Don was hemorrhaging money and power, and he had no idea where the attacks were coming from. His paranoia, already considerable, reached new heights. He ordered investigations into everyone in his inner circle, searching for the traitor who was feeding information to his enemies. Men who had served the family for decades were suddenly suspects. Trust, already a scarce commodity, evaporated entirely. And in the midst of this chaos, Marco reached out to Lucia. He could not approach her directly. The security around her had been doubled in response to the family's troubles, and any contact would be immediately reported to Salvatore. So he found another way. He sent her a package delivered to her townhouse by a courier who had no idea what he was carrying. Inside was a book, a history of Sicilian noble families, with certain passages highlighted. The passages told the story of the Ferrante family, their rise and their fall, their legacy and their one surviving heir. Along with the book was a letter, unsigned but unmistakable in its intent. "Read this," the letter said, "and when you are ready to know the truth, leave a candle burning in your window. I will find you." Marco watched the townhouse from a distance that night, waiting to see how Lucia would respond. For hours there was nothing, just the soft glow of lights behind curtained windows, the occasional shadow of movement within. Then, just after midnight, a candle appeared in the window of the third floor. She was ready. The next night, Marco approached the townhouse through a series of back alleys and service entrances that he had mapped over the previous weeks. The security guards were focused on the front of the building, watching for threats from the street. They did not notice the shadow that slipped through the servants' entrance and made its way silently up the back stairs. Lucia was waiting for him in her private study, the book open on her lap, her face pale in the candlelight. She did not seem surprised to see him. She seemed, if anything, relieved. "It is true," she said. Her voice was steady, but Marco could see the tremor in her hands. "Everything in this book. I am not Salvatore's daughter. I am a Ferrante." Marco closed the door behind him and crossed the room to sit across from her. "Yes. Your birth parents were killed in the same massacre that destroyed my mother's family. You and I are the only Ferrantes left." Lucia stared at him, the weight of this revelation settling over her like a shroud. "And you are my cousin." "I am." She laughed, a sound that was half sob, half disbelief. "I have spent my entire life wondering why I felt like a stranger in my own family. Why I never fit in, no matter how hard I tried. Why Salvatore looked at me sometimes like he was seeing a ghost." She shook her head slowly. "Now I understand. He knew. He must have known all along." Marco reached out and took her hand. His touch seemed to anchor her, to bring her back from whatever precipice she had been standing on. "I came here to tell you the truth, yes, but I also came to offer you a choice. You do not have to stay here, Lucia. You do not have to marry Antonio Benedetto or play the role that Salvatore has assigned to you. You have resources of your own, a heritage of your own, a life that belongs to you and no one else." Lucia looked at him with eyes that were beginning to clear, the shock giving way to something sharper, more focused. What kind of resources? Marco told her about the Ferrante fortune, the inheritance that her birth family had left behind. He told her about the lawyers and accountants who were ready to help her claim what was rightfully hers. And he told her about Veronica's plan to expose her at her own wedding, to destroy her in order to seize power. When he finished, Lucia sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything she had heard. Then she stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had been her prison for 25 years. "I want to leave," she said finally. "I want to disappear, to start over somewhere far from here, somewhere no one knows my name or my history." She turned to face Marco, her expression resolute. "Will you help me?" Marco stood and met her gaze. "That is why I am here." They spent the next 2 hours planning Lucia's escape. It would have to happen before the wedding, before Veronica could execute her scheme. Marco would arrange transportation, documentation, and a safe house where Lucia could stay until the chaos died down. Aurelio Benedetti would handle the legal matters, ensuring that Lucia's claim to the Ferrante fortune was protected. But there was one more thing that needed to be addressed. Lucia insisted on it. "I cannot simply disappear," she said. "If I do, Veronica will spin the narrative however she wants. She will tell everyone that I knew about my heritage and was conspiring against the family. She will use my absence as proof of her lies." "What do you want to do?" Marco asked. Lucia's eyes hardened with a determination that reminded Marco of his mother. "I want to confront them, all of them. I want to stand before my father and tell him the truth before Veronica can twist it. I want the world to know that I am leaving by my own choice, not running in shame. It was a risk, a tremendous risk." But Marco understood the need for it. Lucia had been a prisoner her entire life, controlled by others, denied the right to speak her own truth. This was her chance to reclaim her voice, her identity, her power. "Very well," he said, "we will do it your way, but we do it together." Lucia nodded, and for the first time since Marco had entered the room, she smiled. It was a small smile, fragile but genuine, the first ray of light breaking through decades of darkness. Together, she agreed. The confrontation was set for Sunday dinner at the Vassallo mansion 3 days before the wedding. Lucia would attend as expected, playing her role until the moment was right. Then she would reveal everything, expose Veronica's scheme and walk out of that house forever. Marco would be there too, watching from the shadows, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. He had assembled a team of loyal operatives, men who owed him favors from his years as a fixer, who would ensure that Lucia made it out safely, no matter what happened. The stage was set. The players were in position, and in 3 days the Vassallo Empire would face a reckoning decades in the making. Marco stood on the roof of a building across from the townhouse, watching Lucia's window as the candle flickered and went dark. She was brave, braver than she knew, and she was trusting him with her life, her future, everything she had. He would not fail her. He could not. The ghost of Rosa Ferrante seemed to stand beside him, her presence a comfort and a challenge. She had spent 60 years waiting for this moment, hiding in the shadows, preparing the way for the justice she could never claim herself. Now it fell to Marco to finish what she had started. 3 more days, and everything would change. The fixer looked out over the city that had witnessed so much blood and betrayal, and made a silent promise to the mother he had lost and the cousin he had found. This ends now. The Sunday of the confrontation arrived wrapped in iron-grey clouds that hung low over Staten Island like a funeral shroud. Marco had not slept the night before, his mind running through every possible scenario, every contingency, every way the evening could go wrong. He had positioned his operatives around the Vassallo mansion, men who would wait in the shadows until called upon, ready to extract Lucia at the first sign of danger. He had coordinated with Aurelio Benedetti, ensuring that the legal documents were prepared and the safe house was ready. He had done everything in his power to prepare for what was coming, but some things could not be prepared for. Some moments simply had to be lived through, survived, endured. Lucia called him that morning, her voice steady despite the weight of what lay ahead. "I am ready," she said. "Whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that I am grateful. For the truth, for the choice, for everything." Marco closed his eyes, hearing in her words the echo of his mother's letter. "We are what the world has made us," Rosa had written, "but we do not have to remain so." Lucia was proof of that. She was choosing her own path, reclaiming her own story, even if it meant walking through fire to do it. "Stay strong," he told her. "I will be watching. If anything goes wrong, my people will get you out." "I know," she said. And then after a pause she added something that caught him off guard. "I dreamed about her last night. Your mother, my aunt. She was standing in a field of olive trees, smiling at me. She said that the blood remembers, even when the mind forgets. She said that I would know what to do when the moment came." Marco felt a chill run down his spine. His mother had been dead for weeks, but her presence lingered, her influence reaching from beyond the grave to guide the children she had never stopped protecting. "She was right," he said. "The blood does remember. Trust it. Trust yourself." They said goodbye, and Marco spent the rest of the day in a state of controlled tension, checking and rechecking his preparations, watching the clock crawl toward the hour of reckoning. The dinner was scheduled for 7 o'clock, as it was every Sunday. Lucia would arrive at 6:30 as expected, dressed in the elegant attire that her position demanded. She would sit at the table with Salvatore, Veronica, and the inner circle of the Vassallo family. She would eat, make polite conversation, play her role one last time. And then, when the moment was right, she would speak her truth and walk away from everything she had ever known. Marco positioned himself on a rooftop overlooking the mansion, equipped with binoculars and a communication device that connected him to his operatives. From here, he could see the circular driveway where the guests arrived, the grand entrance where uniformed servants greeted them, the windows of the dining room where the family would gather. He could not hear what was happening inside, but he could watch, wait, and be ready to act. The first cars began arriving at 6:15. Capos and their wives, dressed in their Sunday finest, carrying bottles of wine and expressions of forced cheer. Marco recognized most of them from his years of service. There was Dominic Russo, the aging enforcer who had taught Marco the art of making bodies disappear. There was Angela Toretti, the accountant who cooked the books for a dozen legitimate businesses. There was Father Michael Caruso, the family's personal priest, who heard confessions and granted absolutions for sins that would have made the devil blush. And then, arriving in a black town car with tinted windows, came Salvatore and Veronica Vassallo. The Don emerged first, his silver hair gleaming in the fading light, his face carrying the weight of the troubles that had been plaguing him for months. He looked older than Marco remembered, diminished somehow, as if the attacks on his empire had aged him 10 years in a matter of weeks. Veronica emerged behind him, and Marco felt his jaw tighten at the sight of her. She was radiant in a crimson dress that clung to her curves like sin itself, her dark hair swept up in an elaborate arrangement, diamonds glittering at her throat and ears. She moved like a woman who owned the world, confident and commanding, utterly unaware that her carefully constructed plans were about to crumble around her. Marco watched as they entered the mansion, followed by the rest of the guests. Lucia arrived last, stepping out of her car with the grace of a woman walking to her own execution. She wore a simple black dress, elegant but understated, as if she had already begun to shed the trappings of her former life. Her face was calm, composed, revealing nothing of the storm that must have been raging beneath the surface. "She is inside," Marco said into his communication device. "All teams, stand by." The responses came back in quick succession, confirmations from each of his operatives that they were in position and ready. The trap was set. Now all they could do was wait. Inside the mansion, the dinner proceeded according to its usual ritual. The guests gathered in the parlor for drinks and conversation, their voices echoing off the marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Salvatore held court near the fireplace, discussing business with his capos, while Veronica circulated among the wives, dispensing compliments and collecting gossip. Lucia stood apart, near the window, her glass of wine untouched, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. Father Michael approached her, his weathered face creased with concern. "You seem troubled, my child. Is something wrong?" Lucia turned to him, and for a moment her mask slipped, revealing the fear and determination that lay beneath. "Everything is wrong, Father. But tonight, I intend to make it right." Before the priest could respond, a servant appeared to announce that dinner was served. The guests filed into the dining room, taking their assigned seats at the long mahogany table. Salvatore sat at the head, Veronica at his right hand, Lucia at his left. The rest of the family arranged themselves according to rank and favor, a hierarchy as rigid and unforgiving as any medieval court. The meal began with an appetizer of chilled shrimp and oysters, followed by a soup of roasted tomatoes and basil. The conversation flowed around topics of business and pleasure, the surface chatter masking the currents of tension and suspicion that ran beneath. Everyone at that table had secrets. Everyone had something to hide, but tonight, the biggest secrets of all were about to be dragged into the light. Marco watched through his binoculars as the main course was served, a rack of lamb with roasted vegetables and mint sauce. He could see Lucia's face through the window, her expression unchanged, her hand steady as she cut her food and raised it to her lips. She was waiting for the right moment, the pause between courses when attention would be at its peak. That moment came with the dessert course, a tiramisu that the family chef had spent hours preparing. As the servants cleared the main course and brought out the coffee and sweets, Lucia set down her fork and pushed back her chair. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. The table fell silent. Every eye turned toward her, including the cold, calculating gaze of Veronica. Salvatore frowned, his instincts warning him that something was wrong. "Lucia, this is not the time. We can discuss whatever is troubling you after dinner, in private." "No," Lucia said. She stood, and Marco could see the tremble in her hands, the only sign of the fear she was fighting to control. "This cannot wait. I have been silent for too long, and I will not be silent any longer." She turned to face Salvatore, her eyes meeting his with a directness that made several of the capos shift uncomfortably in their seats. "All my life, you have told me that I am your daughter, that I am a Vassallo bound by blood to this family and its traditions. But that was a lie. Everything you have told me has been a lie." Salvatore's face went pale. "Lucia, I do not know what you think you have discovered, but I assure you there is a perfectly reasonable explanation." "Is there?" Lucia reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a sheaf of papers which she threw onto the table. "These are my adoption records, records that you have kept hidden for 25 years. They show that my real parents were killed in Sicily, that I was taken from the scene of their murder and brought to America, that you adopted me knowing full well who I really was." She paused, letting the words sink in, watching the expressions of shock and confusion spread around the table. "And do you know who my real parents were, Father? They were Ferrantes, the family that your grandfather helped destroy, the family whose fortune you built your empire on." The room erupted in chaos. Voices overlapped, demands for explanation clashing with denials and accusations. Salvatore rose from his seat, his face flushed with rage and fear, while Veronica sat frozen, her carefully laid plans unraveling before her eyes. "This is madness!" Salvatore roared. "Lucia! I do not know who has been filling your head with these lies, but they are trying to destroy this family. They are trying to turn you against me." "The only one who has been lying to me is you," Lucia shot back. "You knew the truth all along. You raised me as your daughter while knowing that your family murdered mine. You used me as a pawn in your games, and you never once thought to tell me who I really was." She turned to face the rest of the table, her gaze sweeping across the assembled members of the Vassallo inner circle. "I am leaving this family. I am renouncing the name Vassallo and reclaiming my birthright as a Ferrante. And I am taking nothing with me except the truth and the freedom to live my own life." Marco watched as Lucia turned and walked toward the door, her head held high, her steps steady despite the chaos erupting behind her. For a moment, it seemed like she would make it, that she would walk out of that house and into the new life she had chosen. Then Veronica moved. "Stop her!" Veronica shouted, her voice cutting through the noise like a whip. "She knows too much. She cannot be allowed to leave." Two of Salvatore's bodyguards blocked the door, their hands moving toward the weapons concealed beneath their jackets. Lucia stopped, her path forward cut off, her eyes widening as she realized the trap she had walked into. Marco did not hesitate. "Go," he said into his communication device. "All teams, go now." The mansion erupted in controlled chaos. Marco's operatives, disguised as servants and catering staff, burst into action, creating diversions and blocking the movements of Salvatore's men. The bodyguards at the door found themselves suddenly surrounded, their weapons useless against opponents who materialized from the shadows around them. In the confusion, a side door opened, and a hand reached out to grab Lucia's arm. It was Marco. His face set in grim determination, his eyes fixed on the path to freedom. "Come with me," he said. "Now." Lucia did not hesitate. She took his hand and ran, leaving behind the dining room and its chaos, leaving behind the family that had raised her on lies, leaving behind everything she had ever known. They burst through a service entrance at the back of the mansion, where a car was waiting with its engine running. Marco pushed Lucia into the back seat and climbed in after her, slamming the door as the driver hit the accelerator. "Go," Marco shouted. "Get us out of here." The car rocketed down the service road, tires screaming as it took the corners at dangerous speeds. Behind them, Marco could see the lights of the mansion growing smaller, the sounds of shouting and sirens fading into the distance. Lucia sat beside him, her breathing ragged, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. "We did it," she gasped. "We actually did it." Marco allowed himself a small smile. "We are not safe yet. Salvatore will send people after us. We need to get you to the safe house and figure out our next move." But even as he spoke, Marco knew that something had changed. The balance of power had shifted. Lucia's public declaration had exposed the lies at the heart of the Vassallo Empire, and nothing would ever be the same. The car sped through the night, carrying them toward an uncertain future. But for the first time in as long as Marco could remember, that uncertainty felt like freedom. They reached the safe house shortly before midnight, a nondescript brownstone in a quiet neighborhood of Brooklyn, where no one asked questions and everyone minded their own business. Marco's operatives had secured the building hours earlier, sweeping for bugs and establishing a perimeter that would alert them to any approaching threats. Lucia collapsed onto the couch in the main room, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation finally beginning to fade. She looked exhausted, drained, but there was a light in her eyes that Marco had never seen before. It was the light of someone who had finally broken free of their chains. What happens now? She asked. Marco poured her a glass of water and sat down across from her. Now we wait. Salvatore will be scrambling to contain the damage. The people at that dinner heard everything, and they will be talking. By tomorrow, the whole organization will know that Lucia Vassallo is actually Lucia Ferrante and that Salvatore has been lying to everyone for 25 years. He paused, considering the implications. The alliances he built were based on trust. Once that trust is broken, the whole structure starts to collapse. The families he planned to unite through your marriage to Antonio Benedetto will be questioning whether they can trust anything he has told them. His capos will be wondering what other secrets he has been keeping. And Veronica, he added with a cold smile, will be watching her plans turn to ash. Lucia was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. And what about me? What happens to my claim to the Ferrante fortune? Aurelio Benedetti is already working on it. The documents proving your parentage are ironclad. Within a few weeks, you will have full legal access to everything your family left behind. He met her eyes, his expression softening. You will never have to depend on anyone again, Lucia. You will have the resources to build whatever life you want, wherever you want to build it. She nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in the corners of her eyes. It is strange, she said. I have spent my whole life wanting to escape, wanting to be free. And now that I am, I do not know what to do with myself. Marco reached out and took her hand, the same gesture of comfort he had offered in her study when he first told her the truth. You do not have to figure it out tonight, or tomorrow, or next week. You have time now, all the time in the world. He squeezed her hand gently. And you are not alone. We are family, Lucia. The only family either of us has left. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Lucia looked at him. This cousin she had never known existed. This man who had risked everything to give her the truth and the freedom to act on it. And in his eyes, she saw something she had never found in all her years among the Vassallos. She saw genuine love. Thank you, Marco, she whispered, for everything. They sat together in the quiet of the safe house, two survivors of a legacy of blood and betrayal, as the night deepened around them, and the first light of a new day began to gather on the horizon. But their ordeal was not over. Even as they rested, forces were mobilizing against them. Salvatore Vassallo, his empire crumbling, his pride wounded, his rage burning white-hot, was preparing his response. And Veronica, her ambitions thwarted, her schemes exposed, was plotting a revenge that would make everything that had come before pale in comparison. The war was far from over. The most dangerous battles were yet to come, and Marco De Luca, the fixer who had become a destroyer, would need every ounce of skill and cunning he possessed to survive what was coming next. The phone rang at 3 in the morning, shattering the fragile peace of the safe house. Marco answered on the second ring, his instincts already screaming that something was wrong. It was Enzo Carbone. You need to listen carefully, the old consigliere said. His voice was strained, urgent, stripped of the enigmatic calm that had always characterized him. Salvatore has lost his mind. He has called in every favor, mobilized every soldier, put a price on both your heads that would make a man kill his own mother. But that is not the worst of it. Marco felt his blood turn to ice. What is the worst of it? Veronica, Enzo said. She has taken matters into her own hands. She has made a deal with the Benedettos, promised them things that Salvatore does not even know about. In exchange, they have agreed to help her eliminate you, Lucia, and anyone else who stands in her way. The old man paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with sorrow. She has also promised them Salvatore. She is going to have her own husband killed, Marco, and she is going to blame it on you. Marco closed his eyes, processing this information. Veronica had always been ambitious, but this was something else entirely. This was a coup, a complete takeover of the Vassallo Empire, with Marco and Lucia cast as the convenient scapegoats. When? He asked. Tomorrow night, Enzo said. There is a meeting scheduled at the old warehouse on the waterfront, the one where Salvatore stores his imports. She has convinced him that you will be there, trying to destroy his remaining assets. He is planning to confront you personally, to make an example of you in front of his men, But Veronica has arranged for the Benedettos to be waiting. When Salvatore arrives, they will kill him. And then they will hunt down you and Lucia and finish the job." Marco opened his eyes, his mind already racing through possibilities. "Why are you telling me this, Enzo? You have been protecting secrets for 60 years. Why reveal this now?" "Because I am tired," Enzo said simply. "Tired of serving monsters. Tired of watching innocent people suffer for the ambitions of the corrupt. Your mother was my friend, Marco. She trusted me to protect her secret, and I did. Now I am trusting you to finish what she started, to end this cycle of violence and betrayal once and for all." The line went silent for a moment, and when Enzo spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "There is one more thing. Veronica does not know that I know about her plans. She thinks I am still loyal to Salvatore. I can get you into that warehouse tomorrow night, get you close enough to turn the tables on all of them. But after that I am done. I have made my peace with God. Whatever happens next is in your hands." The call ended, and Marco stood in the darkness, the weight of what he had learned pressing down on him like a physical force. Tomorrow night. One chance to end everything, one chance to destroy Veronica's schemes, expose her treachery, and bring the Vassallo empire crashing down once and for all. He looked over at Lucia, still sleeping on the couch, her face peaceful in the dim light. She had already been through so much. She deserved the new life she had fought for, the freedom she had claimed, and Marco would do whatever it took to ensure she got it. Even if it meant walking into a trap. Even if it meant facing Salvatore Vassallo one last time. Even if it meant dying. The fixer had one more job to do, and this time failure was not an option. The waterfront warehouse stood like a monument to decay, its rusted walls and shattered windows, bearing witness to decades of illicit commerce. This was where Salvatore Vassallo had built the foundation of his empire, where shipments of contraband had passed through countless hands, where men had disappeared into the darkness, never to be seen again. And tonight, it would serve as the stage for the final act of a tragedy, 60 years in the making. Marco arrived 2 hours before the scheduled meeting, slipping through the shadows with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life moving unseen. Enzo Carbone had provided him with the security codes and patrol schedules, allowing him to bypass the guards that Salvatore had posted around the perimeter. He made his way to a catwalk high above the main floor, a vantage point from which he could observe everything that happened below. The warehouse was cavernous, filled with stacks of shipping containers and wooden crates that created a labyrinth of potential hiding spots. Salvatore had chosen this location for its defensibility, but Marco knew its layout better than anyone. He had spent years overseeing operations here, cleaning up the messes that inevitably accumulated in places where violence was the primary currency. Every shadow, every corner, every potential ambush point was mapped in his memory. He checked his equipment one final time, a pistol loaded and ready, a recording device that would capture everything said in the warehouse, and a phone, pre-programmed with numbers that would summon federal agents, journalists and lawyers at the touch of a button. Tonight was not just about survival. It was about exposure. It was about ensuring that the truth could never be buried again. Lucia had wanted to come with him. She had argued, pleaded, even threatened to follow him regardless of his wishes. But Marco had been firm. This was his fight. His responsibility. His debt to pay. Lucia had already risked enough. Her role now was to stay safe, to protect herself and the future they had both sacrificed so much to secure. She had finally relented, but not before making him promise to come back. "I have lost too many people," she had said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I cannot lose you too, not now, not after everything." Marco had made the promise, knowing it might be one he could not keep, but he had meant it with every fiber of his being. He would do whatever it took to survive this night and return to the only family he had left. The first vehicles arrived at 11:30, black SUVs that pulled into the loading dock with military precision. Marco watched through his binoculars as men emerged, spreading out through the warehouse, taking up positions that suggested they were expecting trouble. These were Salvatore's soldiers, the loyal remnants of an army that had been slowly bleeding away over the past months. Salvatore himself arrived 15 minutes later, stepping out of an armored sedan with the rigid posture of a man preparing for battle. He looked haggard, aged beyond his years, the toll of recent events written in every line of his face, but there was still fire in his eyes, the cold fury of a predator who refused to accept that his reign was ending. Veronica was not with him. Marco noted this with grim satisfaction. She was maintaining her distance, ensuring that she would have plausible deniability when the violence began. She would be somewhere safe, waiting for the news that her husband was dead and her path to power was clear. But Marco had plans of his own. He watched as Salvatore conferred with his lieutenants, issuing orders in a voice too low to carry to the catwalk. The Don was expecting Marco to appear, to make some foolish attempt to destroy the remaining Vassallo assets. He had brought enough firepower to repel a small army, confident that his superior numbers would crush any opposition. What he did not know was that his real enemies were already inside the warehouse, waiting in the shadows, ready to spring a trap that Veronica had carefully constructed. The Benedettos arrived at midnight, their vehicles entering through a side entrance that Salvatore's men were not monitoring. Marco counted 12 of them, hardened killers armed with automatic weapons, moving with the silent efficiency of professionals. They took up positions among the shipping containers, invisible to the Vassallo soldiers who were focused on the main entrance. The trap was set. Salvatore was surrounded by enemies masquerading as allies, walking into an ambush that his own wife had orchestrated, and he had no idea. Marco could have let it happen. He could have sat on his catwalk and watched as Salvatore Vassallo was gunned down by the people he trusted, a fitting end for a man who had built his empire on betrayal and blood. It would have been justice of a sort, the universe balancing its scales through the very mechanisms of treachery that Salvatore had employed throughout his life. But that was not why Marco was here. He was here because Veronica needed to be stopped, because letting her succeed would mean trading one monster for another, replacing Salvatore's brutality with Veronica's cold ambition. Because the cycle of violence would continue, claiming new victims, destroying new lives, perpetuating the curse that had haunted both the Ferrante and Vassallo bloodlines for generations. And he was here because, despite everything Salvatore had done, despite the humiliation and the betrayal and the years of servitude, Marco De Luca was not a murderer. He was a fixer. And tonight he would fix this broken situation one final time. He keyed his communication device, connecting to the network of operatives he had positioned throughout the area. "All teams, stand by. Wait for my signal." The responses came back in quick succession, confirmations that his people were ready. Marco took a deep breath, steadied his nerves, and began to move. He descended from the catwalk using a maintenance ladder, dropping silently to the warehouse floor. The shadows here were deep, the dim lighting creating pools of darkness that he navigated with practiced ease. He moved toward the center of the warehouse, where Salvatore stood surrounded by his men, waiting for an enemy who was supposed to come through the front door. Marco stepped out of the shadows and into the light. "Salvatore," he called, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "We need to talk." The reaction was immediate and violent. A dozen guns swung toward him, fingers tightening on triggers, men shouting warnings and demands. But Salvatore raised his hand, freezing his soldiers in place, his eyes fixed on Marco with an expression of pure hatred. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here," the Don said. "After everything you have done, after the chaos you have caused." He took a step forward, his bodyguards moving with him like extensions of his will. "I should have had you killed years ago. I should have listened to my instincts instead of keeping you around like a faithful dog." Marco stood his ground, his hands visible, his posture non-threatening. "You should be more concerned about the people who are actually trying to kill you tonight, Salvatore. Your wife, for instance." Salvatore's face contorted with rage. "Do not try to turn me against Veronica with your lies. She is the only one who has stood by me through all of this. She is the only one I can trust." "Is she?" Marco gestured toward the shadows on the far side of the warehouse, where the Benedetto gunmen were hidden. "Then why did she arrange for 12 of Antonio Benedetto's best killers to be waiting in this warehouse right now? Why did she promise them control of your territory in exchange for putting a bullet in your head?" Salvatore's eyes narrowed, doubt flickering across his face for the first time. "You are lying. You are trying to save yourself by poisoning me against my own wife." Marco shook his head slowly. "I am trying to save your life, Salvatore. Not because you deserve it, but because your death at Veronica's hands would only make things worse. It would make her a martyr, a grieving widow who rose from tragedy to take control of the family. It would give her the legitimacy she needs to rule unchallenged." He met the Don's gaze without flinching. "I am not going to let that happen." He reached into his pocket, slowly, giving Salvatore's men time to see that he was not reaching for a weapon. He withdrew a small recording device and held it up. "This is a recording of Veronica's conversation with the Benedettos," he said. "It details her entire plan, including how she intends to blame your murder on me. She has been working against you for months, Salvatore, building alliances, gathering power, waiting for the moment when she could push you aside and take everything you have built." He pressed a button, and Veronica's voice filled the warehouse, crystal clear and unmistakable. "Salvatore has become a liability," she said in the recording. "His paranoia is destroying the organization. Once he is eliminated, I will take control and restore order. The Benedettos will be rewarded for their loyalty, and anyone who opposes me will be dealt with accordingly." The recording continued, detailing the specifics of the ambush, the positions of the killers, the signals that would initiate the attack. As it played, Marco watched the expressions of the men around Salvatore change from suspicion to shock to cold fury. These were soldiers who had pledged their lives to the Vassallo family, and they were hearing proof that the Don's own wife had betrayed them all. When the recording ended, the warehouse was silent. Salvatore stood frozen, his face ashen, his eyes reflecting the shattered remnants of his trust. For a moment, he looked like what he truly was, an old man who had lost everything, whose empire had crumbled, whose wife had plotted his murder, whose legacy was nothing but ashes and blood. Then his expression hardened, the vulnerability replaced by the cold calculation that had made him the most feared man in New York for 2 decades. "The Benedettos," he said quietly. "Where are they?" Marco pointed toward the shipping containers on the far side of the warehouse. 12 men, armed with automatic weapons, waiting for the signal to open fire. Salvatore nodded slowly, processing this information. "And why are you telling me this? Why save me when you have every reason to want me dead?" Marco considered the question. The truth was complicated, a tangle of motivations that even he did not fully understand. But there was one thread that ran through all of it, one reason that overshadowed all the others. "Because my mother would have wanted me to," he said. "Because Rosa Ferrante, the woman you knew as Rosa De Luca, spent her entire life trying to break the cycle of violence that destroyed her family. She could have used her fortune to wage war against the Vassallos. She could have hired armies, bought politicians, torn your empire apart piece by piece. But she did not. She chose a different path. She chose to wait, to watch, to hope that someday, somehow, the killing would stop." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the warehouse. "I am here tonight to honor that choice. Not to kill you, Salvatore, to expose you, to bring your crimes into the light and let justice take its course, and to stop Veronica from perpetuating the very cycle my mother spent her life trying to end." Salvatore stared at him for a long moment, emotions warring behind his eyes. Then slowly he turned to his men and issued a single command. "Find the Benedettos. Take them alive, if possible. Dead, if necessary." The warehouse erupted into controlled chaos. Salvatore's soldiers spread out, moving toward the positions Marco had identified, their weapons raised and ready. Shouts echoed through the cavernous space, followed by the crack of gunfire as the Benedetto killers realized they had been discovered. Marco pressed himself against a shipping container as the battle raged around him. This was not his fight, not anymore. He had done what he came to do. He had exposed Veronica's treachery, saved Salvatore's life, and set in motion events that would bring the entire corrupt edifice crashing down. Now he needed to get out alive. He made his way toward the side entrance, moving through the shadows as bullets ricocheted off metal containers and men screamed in the darkness. His operatives were waiting outside, ready to extract him the moment he emerged. All he had to do was reach the door. He was 10 feet from the exit when Veronica stepped out of the shadows, a pistol in her hand, her beautiful face twisted with rage. "You," she hissed, "you have ruined everything." Marco froze, his hand moving instinctively toward his own weapon, but Veronica was faster, her gun already trained on his chest, her finger tight on the trigger. "I should have killed you myself," she continued, her voice trembling with fury. "The moment Salvatore brought you into our lives, I knew you would be trouble. But I thought you were broken. I thought you were weak. I thought I could use you and discard you like the worthless tool you were." She laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. "I was wrong. You are not weak at all, are you, Marco? You are dangerous. You are the most dangerous man I have ever met, and now you are going to die." Marco met her gaze without flinching. "You can pull that trigger, Veronica. You can kill me right here, right now, but it will not change anything. The recording has already been sent to every major news outlet in the city. The federal agents I contacted are already on their way. Your scheme is exposed, your allies are being captured or killed as we speak, and your husband knows exactly what you are planning to do." He took a step toward her, watching her finger tighten on the trigger. "You have lost, Veronica. Everything you worked for, everything you schemed and manipulated and betrayed to achieve, it is gone. Killing me will not bring it back. It will only ensure that you spend the rest of your life in prison instead of finding some way to escape the consequences of what you have done." Veronica's hand trembled, the barrel of the gun wavering. For a moment, Marco thought she might actually fire, might end his life in a final act of spite and rage. But then something shifted in her expression, the fury giving way to calculation, the primal need for revenge yielding to the cold pragmatism that had always defined her. She lowered the gun. "This is not over," she said quietly. "You may have won tonight, Marco, but I will find a way. I always find a way." She turned and disappeared into the shadows, fleeing toward an exit on the far side of the warehouse. Marco let her go. She would not get far. The police would be arriving any moment, and his operatives were positioned to intercept anyone trying to escape. Veronica Vassallo would face justice one way or another. He pushed through the side door and emerged into the cold night air, where his team was waiting with a vehicle ready to go. He climbed into the back seat and slumped against the leather, exhaustion washing over him like a wave. "Get me out of here," he said. "Take me to Lucia." The car pulled away as sirens began to wail in the distance, converging on the warehouse from every direction. Behind them, the Vassallo Empire was collapsing, its secrets exposed, its soldiers scattered, its leaders facing arrest or death. And in the midst of all that chaos, one man had walked out alive, carrying with him the seeds of a new beginning. The safe house was quiet when Marco arrived, the pre-dawn darkness broken only by a single lamp burning in the front window. Lucia was waiting for him at the door, her face pale with worry, her eyes searching his for any sign of injury or distress. He stepped inside and took her in his arms, holding her close, letting the warmth of her presence wash away the cold that had settled into his bones. She was trembling, he realized, shaking with relief and fear and a dozen other emotions that words could not capture. "It is over," he whispered. "It is finally over." They stood like that for a long time, two survivors clinging to each other in the aftermath of a storm that had threatened to destroy them both. The night had been long and terrible, filled with violence and betrayal and the ghosts of the past. But they had made it through. They had survived. And now, finally, they could begin to live. The days that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, press conferences, and the slow unraveling of the Vassallo Empire. The recording Marco had made became the centerpiece of a federal investigation that exposed decades of criminal activity, implicating dozens of officials, businessmen, and law enforcement officers who had been on the Vassallo payroll. Salvatore himself was arrested 3 days after the warehouse incident, charged with enough crimes to ensure he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Veronica was captured trying to flee the country, her passport flagged by authorities who had been alerted to her role in the conspiracy. She was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and a litany of other offenses that would keep her behind bars for decades. When she was led into the courthouse for her arraignment, cameras captured the image of a woman who had lost everything, her beauty diminished by the harsh light of accountability, her eyes empty of everything but hatred. Enzo Carbone testified against the family he had served for 50 years, providing evidence that corroborated Marco's recordings and filled in gaps that the authorities had struggled to understand. In exchange for his cooperation, he was granted immunity and allowed to retire quietly to a small house in the countryside, where he spent his remaining days tending a garden and making peace with his past. And Lucia Ferrante, the woman who had been raised as a Vassallo, finally claimed her birthright. Aurelio Benedetti guided her through the legal process of establishing her identity and taking control of the Ferrante fortune, a process that took months but ultimately succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. When the final documents were signed, Lucia found herself the sole heir to an estate worth billions of dollars. The last survivor of a family that had been thought extinct for 60 years, she used the money wisely, establishing foundations to help victims of organized crime, funding programs to support children who had been orphaned by violence, and investing in communities that had been devastated by the drug trade. The Ferrante name, once associated with tragedy and loss, became a symbol of hope and renewal, a testament to the power of one woman's determination to transform pain into purpose. Marco stood beside her through all of it, her partner and protector, her cousin and confidant. He had refused any claim to the Ferrante fortune, insisting that the money belonged to Lucia and should be used according to her wishes. But she had insisted on sharing it with him, establishing a trust that ensured he would never want for anything again. More importantly, she had given him something that no amount of money could buy. She had given him a family. She had given him a home. She had given him a reason to believe that the future could be different from the past. 1 year after the night at the warehouse, Marco and Lucia stood together at a small cemetery in the Bronx, looking down at the headstone that marked Rosa De Luca's final resting place. The stone had been replaced with something grander, a monument worthy of the woman who had been both Rosa De Luca, the seamstress, and Rosa Ferrante, the secret trillionaire. "I wish she could have seen this," Lucia said quietly. "I wish she could have known how it all turned out." Marco nodded, his eyes fixed on the words carved into the stone. Rosa Maria Ferrante de Luca, beloved mother, keeper of secrets, guardian of hope. "She knows," he said. "Wherever she is, she knows." They stood in silence for a moment, the autumn wind rustling through the trees, carrying with it the promise of change and renewal. The past was behind them now, its debts paid, its wounds beginning to heal. The future stretched out before them, vast and uncertain, but full of possibility. "What now?" Lucia asked. "What do we do with the rest of our lives?" Marco considered the question. For so long his life had been defined by service to others, by the needs of the family he had served, and the secrets he had kept. He had never had the luxury of asking what he wanted, what he dreamed of, what he might become if given the chance. But now, standing in the cemetery where his mother lay at rest, surrounded by the evidence of everything they had accomplished, he finally allowed himself to imagine. "We live," he said simply. "We honor her memory by living the lives she wanted us to have. Free from fear, free from violence, free from the shadows that haunted her for 60 years. He turned to look at Lucia, seeing in her face the same determination, the same hope, the same fierce will to survive that had carried them both through the darkest nights. "We are the last of the Ferrantes," he said, "but we do not have to be the end of the story. We can be the beginning of something new, something better, something worthy of everything she sacrificed to give us this chance." Lucia smiled, and in that smile Marco saw the future he had never dared to dream of, a future where the sins of the past no longer defined the possibilities of the present, a future where family meant love and loyalty rather than blood and betrayal, a future where the name Ferrante would stand not for tragedy, but for triumph. She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, and together they turned away from the grave and walked toward the car that waited at the edge of the cemetery. Behind them, the headstone gleamed in the afternoon light, a silent sentinel watching over the secrets it had finally been allowed to release. And somewhere, in whatever realm exists beyond the veil of death, Rosa Maria Ferrante. De Luca smiled at the children she had loved, the legacy she had protected, and the justice that had finally, after 60 years of patience and pain been served. The fixer had become a builder, the prisoner had become free, and the shadows that had haunted two families for generations had finally irrevocably been banished by the light. This was not an ending. It was a beginning, and for Marco De Luca and Lucia Ferrante the best was yet to come.